Hi, and welcome to PSYCHlops. Today we're going to be starting a new segment discussing psychological issues that people tend to bring on themselves, such as things like video game addiction or attachment issues as related to MMOs, that sort of thing. Now, generally speaking, psychoses are described as being somewhat of a major break from reality. We see these a lot in schizotypal disorders, and they appear as hallucinations, delusions, that sort of thing. But a break with reality can mean a lot of things, and at varying degrees of significance. And not everything that alters the way a person perceives reality can be considered a mental illness. And with that in mind, we're going to go ahead and dive right in and discuss something that I have noticed appearing more and more frequently, from internet forums to popular media, and that's the idea of the tulpa. For the uninitiated, let's take a look at what a tulpa is and where it comes from. The tulpa is found in a variety of cultures, but may be best understood as a Tibetan Buddhist teaching tool. It can be considered to be roughly the same idea as a thought form, which is a term coined by anthropologist Walter Evans Wentz around 1954, and the concept of the tulpa was introduced to the West first by an explorer by the name of Alexandria David Neal. She claimed to have made a Friar Tuck-style tulpa. Now, as the practice goes, the tulpa is a construct, which can be an object, a person, or a disembodied voice, anything like that, created through concentration and discipline. Now, supposedly, this is an autonomous and even a pseudo-sentient construct created by the mind, complete with autonomous thinking, its own likes, emotions, and even specific communication mannerisms. I say that it's pseudo-sentient because while it is able to think for itself and have its own individual personality traits, it is not a truly separate entity. It is still just a function of your mind. Given that fact, it is generally not visible or interactive to others. Although there are some claims that a tulpa can take on a loose, somewhat ghostly corporeal form. However, this can supposedly only be achieved in certain circumstances and by certain people. Masters of the art, that sort of thing. Naturally, there is little to no reliable documentation of this ever having occurred. I realize that the description at this point is still a little vague, so here's a point of comparison. Imagine a kid with an imaginary friend. Now take that concept and multiply it exponentially. The tulpa is more or less the same thing, but with a few key differences. For example, you know exactly what the tulpa looks like, regardless of orientation or what's happening. You know what their mannerisms are, all of them. You know their tone of voice, the timbre, how high they can go as far as singing or anything of that nature. They even have a smell. This is a complete package creation. Naturally, of course, this is a very time-consuming process, and some sources have even claimed that it can take upward of 100 hours of concentrated effort to create a fully formed tulpa. Now, of course, this doesn't happen all in one go. It's several hours, or even just a couple of hours a day, but it's still a concentrated effort that can take a substantial amount of time. And even once the tulpa is created, the story's not done. You still have a lot of work to do to maintain it. It's not as much work as the creation process, but even maintaining this sort of higher level thinking is a time-consuming process requiring specific efforts. However, the payoff upon success can be quite compelling. If you're actually able to pull it off, you could theoretically have a companion that completely understands you 100%. They will know what you know, remember what you remember, and be able to talk to you about those things. And not as a straw man kind of approach, but as a genuine, simulated person, or whatever it is that you have made. It has the potential to provide meaningful and substantial conversation, because after all, you can't really hide anything from your tulpa. All the conversations and dialogue would be genuine. We can see the tulpa being used in pop culture in a few different ways, and I admit that I'm pulling these examples from Wikipedia, so 0 points on creativity for me. But let's move on. In a Fantastic Four story by Grant Morrison, Dr. Doom starts off as a tulpa created by Reed Richards. He becomes strong enough to maintain himself and eventually becomes the enemy of Reed Richards. A tulpa was even used in one Batman tale by a Tibetan man seeking revenge on extortionists, and even Dr. Seuss's book, The Glunk That Got Thunk, is a story about a tulpa. Interestingly, in Clive Barker's Candyman, the Candyman himself was originally intended to be a group-based tulpa. And I know I haven't mentioned anything about group tulpas, but the idea in a nutshell is that if you have enough people gathered together who have a similar idea of what a certain construct should be, then it's enough to create that construct. For example, if I say to you, imagine a wizard, and you imagine a guy with a pointy hat and a robe, if you get enough people together with enough specific ideas of what a wizard could be, you might be able to pull off a wizard tulpa. Naturally, the group tulpa idea is more complicated than that, but that's the rough and dirty explanation. Now, as far as whether or not a tulpa is a self-imposed psychosis, well, on the surface, it starts to look like the beginnings of a hallucination, assuming, of course, that you can see the tulpa yourself, or even a full-blown dissociative break with your own personality. And naturally, several psychotic disorders, quite serious ones, have characteristics that follow similar trends, such as schizophrenia, mood disorders with psychotic symptoms, and even dementia, which can be brought on by something as simple as a tumor enacting pressure on a specific region of the brain. However, despite the similarities to many serious conditions, the tulpa is not actually a self-imposed mental illness. And while it does share similar characteristics, there are key differences. First, and maybe most importantly, the tulpa does not represent a serious disruption in the daily life of the individual or the people around them, nor is there any significant risk of injury to self or to others. Granted, the creation of a tulpa can be a time-consuming process, and true, the creator could shirk their responsibilities to create the tulpa, but this is a problem that stems from an issue with time management, or even attention, and not strictly from the tulpa itself. Second, the hallucinations and delusions associated with the disorders that I mentioned earlier are generally outside the control of those experiencing them, and while a fully formed tulpa is always present in some capacity for the person that created it, due to it being a direct, controlled manifestation of the mind, it is not outside of the creator's influence and can be dismissed and even dissolved over time. I think perhaps that the most interesting thing about the tulpa is that it is a demonstration of the raw power of the human mind. Given enough time and enough willpower, a person can create a remarkable simulation of sentience that appears autonomous and individual, totally unique from the person who created it. So often we hear about how limited the brain can be and how easily it can be fooled. It's actually kind of nice to hear every once in a while that there is actually a lot of horsepower under the hood, as long as you are willing to put in the time and energy to use it. Well, I think that about wraps up this episode. If you enjoyed what you watched, click the like button. Feel free to leave comments down below, post some requests for future episodes, and as always, thanks for watching.